Welcome to Off the Clock, the webcast of employment attorneys at Miller Johnson, where we discuss what is happening in the HR world and provide practical insight and advice. We are your co-hosts, Rebecca Strauss and Sarah Willey, two employment lawyers who spend their days guiding employers through all of the challenges that workplaces offer. Good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning, Sarah. How are you?
I am very well. I'm very well. I am not even going to spend time on small talk, though, today, because...
That's my favorite part.
I know.
It's the only reason I'm here.
I know. But today we have a topic that I think this is the first time we've sat down to chat, and it's been so clear to us what we needed to talk about. Don't you agree?
Oh, I agree.
I mean, there's one topic that is just consuming our inbox and our phone calls and our Zooms and everything else, right? And that is the vaccine mandates, but really even more specifically those religious accommodation requests as they relate to vaccine mandates.
Agree. When an employer is taking a step to mandate the vaccine, that's where the rubber hits the road.
Right.
That is 90% of HR's time.
Sure.
Is working through the religious accommodation process.
Right. And as we're seeing, of course, now what's happened in the last several weeks is that the federal government has announced a series of requirements for employers to mandate the COVID-19 vaccine. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the first of those for federal employees and federal contractors and subcontractors has now been implemented with an effective date of December 8th, right? So we're talking to lots of businesses that fall under that requirement, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to get in compliance by December 8th. And then we also have healthcare organizations that have either chosen on their own to mandate the vaccine or now have come to realize that they're going to have to do that if they want to continue to receive Medicare and Medicaid funding, which of course they all do, right? And then on top of that, we have OSHA's emergency temporary standard. Suffice to say, all of the sudden, vaccine mandates are something that HR people are thinking about more than ever. And they quickly realize that that framework includes a process by which they need to consider and evaluate accommodations, including accommodations for sincerely held religious beliefs. And man, are we getting lots of questions about that, right?
Yes. Employers just simply haven't had to think these issues through carefully in the past very often. Every once in a while, right? There's been scheduling requests, things like that, not wanting to work on a Saturday or a Sunday, whatever the Sabbath is for that religion, those sorts of things. So we have, certainly in our lives, we've come across religious accommodation requests, I don't want to say routinely, but it's not an unusual legal issue for us to talk a client through. But for a lot of clients, they either have never done it or they've never done it in this volume. Yes. And the volume itself for our clients that have already initiated mandatory policies because of the reasons you explained, the volume is just very time intensive.
They're learning so many new things.
I know, isn't it exciting?
I'm not sure that's been the general reaction.
When you've been doing HR for a while, sometimes you might have thought your job was getting a little stale. And now we have this.
And now we have this.
This period in my career, this month and last month, reminds me a little bit of the beginning of COVID, to be honest with you, where everyone's got the same thing on their minds at the same time.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think it's not quite as intense. The rules aren't changing every day and every hour, which is quite a relief. But it's a little bit of a throwback to me, right? When all of our clients kind of have the same questions and the same concerns and the same needs, all at the same time. So how can we help?
Yes,
right?
That's exactly right. And as a reminder to our listeners, a couple of episodes ago, we did talk more generally about a process and what documentation to have in place for a vaccine mandate. So we're not going to talk about that much today, if at all, but let's just talk only about religious accommodations.
Right.
Shall we do that?
Because that's the most time-intensive part right now for HR departments that are wrestling with this.
Okay.
Yep.
So, Rebecca, let me ask this question first, because I've gotten it a couple of times in the last few days, and I'm wondering what you think about it. Okay. If an employer is mandating the vaccine, whether because it's choosing to or it's being required to, do they have to affirmatively tell employees that if they are not vaccinated or don't plan to be, they can request a religious accommodation?
Well, that's a great question. And the answer is generally no. There is no legal requirement that you inform people of their legal rights to request an accommodation. But we've been recommending it throughout this whole process, right? And the EEOC just updated its guidance fairly recently, right, on vaccination issues and process and accommodations and all of that. It didn't get a lot of press, but we were on it. And
we were excited about it, nonetheless. Yes.
Well, we get excited about silly things.
True. Fair enough.
And again, throwback to the beginning of COVID when there were updates, daily, weekly. We kind of haven't had that adrenaline rush in a while, right? Where we compare this copy versus that copy, and then we go through it, and then the email goes around the firm explaining, right, what just happened. So it was a little nostalgic. But anywho, one of the things that the EEOC said is they also recommend it's best practice to inform people. Okay. So why do we think it's best practice? First of all, this is a hot topic right now.
Right.
Every one of your employees who is considering requesting an accommodation for a sincerely held religious belief, they know, right? They know. And by not putting it out there and just being upfront about it, to me, it could send a message of somehow that you're resistant to it, right? Or don't understand the process yourself, or that the employee understands the process better than you, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And it just opens up the door, too, for them to say eventually, you didn't offer me an opportunity to ask for an accommodation.
Right. And as I think about it, too, I do think there's even benefit to be had to the employer to tell employees that that's an option, and tell them how they need to do it, so that we don't have employees going to frontline supervisors, people on the floor, et cetera, making these requests, and maybe not having that response be what it should be under Title VII. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So there's benefit to say, yes, you can request it. Here's how you do it. Please go to the HR department in order to make a request, so that the people who are trained and understand what the law is then are the ones handling that process.
Exactly.
Okay. So based on my experience then, as soon as an employer opens that door, they can assume they're going to get some requests, right?
Yes.
Some requests.
Yes.
Most often, based on what I'm seeing, is many, many more requests than any employer might have guessed before this pandemic, right? If you asked these HR folks 3 years ago, what percentage of your workforce do you think holds religious beliefs so sincerely, right, that they would be resistant to getting a vaccine? I don't think it would be anywhere near the numbers of people that they're seeing actually make those requests today.
We have certainly seen a resurgence in religious beliefs, haven't we?
For sure.
And so we're chuckling about that, which I think is typical, right, of what's happening with lots of employers when they get a glut of requests. So let's talk about then, what do we do? How do we examine the request? Because to be fair, there are some religions, right, that for a long, long time have been resistant to medical intervention, including vaccines. Right?
Sure, absolutely. Let me ask you this, because this is the next question I always get, right? I'm getting, which is, okay, so what can we require an employee to provide
Yes.
when they come to us and say, I cannot be vaccinated because I have a religious belief? What sort of documentation can we have them provide? It's limited, isn't it?
It's very limited. This is not the ADA or the FMLA, right?
Right.
So actually this question just came up this morning. Can I require them to have a religious leader in their organization? Sign some sort of attestation, right? Or
Okay.
No. And that's because it goes to how broad religious belief can be.
Okay.
A religious belief does not have to be connected to any organized church, synagogue, mosque, etc., right? It can be a religious belief that only that employee holds. They might be a member of a certain faith and disagree with the leaders, right, of that faith, disagree with their own local pastor or minister on something. But if they sincerely believe it and it's tied to a religious belief, then that's a request you need to consider, right? So asking for documentation from a religious leader is going to be a no-go, right? That honestly, that was a question I just got.
Okay.
Morning.
So what can and should an HR representative ask for then?
So it's certainly fine to ask if the individual has received other vaccines in the past, right? And if so, what makes, why this one? You can certainly ask about more details about the religious belief. But if they do say they're with an organized faith, ask for more details about that, supporting documentation, that sort of thing. All of those things are fair game.
So one thing that I've been encouraging employers to do is require employees to put in their own words and in their own writing an explanation of what their religious belief is and how it is sincerely held, right?
Yes.
Which avoids people going to the internet, printing off some sort of statement that's available, or just having a religious leader write to whom it may concern letters and handing them out to anybody who would like one and having them bring that in.
That's what I've been seeing a lot from clients, are these to whom it may concern from local religious, right? Not necessarily something printed off the internet, and they tend to be very long and include lots and lots and lots of reasons.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to determine whether the employee themselves, right, hold each of those beliefs.
So certainly fair for an employer to say to an employee, no, you need to say this in your own words.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
On a form, write it out, however you want to do it, right? No plagiarism, right? It's got to be in your own words. High school rules. And I'm also seeing, and I think that this is can be a good idea in some circumstances too. I'm seeing many HR folks meeting in person with employees, making requests for religious accommodations and having sort of a one-on-one conversation with the idea of, if this is an employee who doesn't really hold this religious belief and is maybe only saying that because they don't want to be vaccinated, at least you're making them come and say it to your face. And if they have to do it, employees might be less likely to make requests that aren't legitimate.
Right. I agree with that. I think that's a great strategy, putting the human back in human resources.
Yes, I like that. I like that.
So much about what we do in our advice is and how to approach employees.
How to have a conversation.
How to have a conversation and have that, also that empathy. I just think it'll make the whole process go better, frankly.
Okay. And you mentioned you could ask, so for example, if an employer had a form that said, explain your religious belief and how it's sincerely held, they could ask, have you received other vaccines in recent years, maybe the last 2 or 3 years? And if so, what's different now, or what's different about this vaccine.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. That's fair. The EEOC has blessed that. Can I use that word at this podcast? Yes, the EEOC has blessed that type of question, asking about why they've done things in the past that seem contrary to the religious belief they are expressing today.
Okay. I've heard some conversation around requests that are based on a belief that the COVID vaccine used a line of fetal cells in its research, right? And so some individuals have religious objections to taking a vaccine that used fetal cells at some point during the research process. To be clear, the vaccine doesn't have fetal cells in it, but a line of fetal cells, as I understand it, were used in the research process at some point. And I've seen lists of other common products, medications, things like Advil and other things that also have that same use of fetal cells in research. And I've seen employers ask employees who are making that particular argument, right, objection, whether they take or use any of those products. What do you think about that?
Well, my answer to this is the answer, frankly, to wrap up this whole discussion, which is employers, asking these kinds of questions makes employers feel a lot better. And even when I say what I'm going to say, employers still choose to ask the questions. Right. But at the end of the day, these questions are not hard for a motivated employee to answer.
Sure. Right.
And so the answer to that question is, well, I didn't know that.
Right. Okay.
That is, I mean, I actually had a client who asked the question, and that was the answer. Well, I never knew that before.
Yeah. Which could very well be true.
Absolutely.
Because nor did I.
Oh, and by the way, a sincerely held religious belief can change from yesterday. So it could have been, my belief system has evolved since last year when I got the flu vaccine.
Right.
Because of COVID and the COVID vaccine, I've been doing lots of research, right? With scientific research maybe, or research with my religious organization and leaders, et cetera. And I just never had put in that much thought before.
I haven't had to think about it as hard as I have.
And now if I thought about it like this years past, I probably wouldn't have done those things.
Right.
So these questions are first of all, for an employee who has a sincerely held religious belief, and maybe for some others, it's not hard to answer these
provide
questions.
An explanation. But okay to ask.
Absolutely okay to ask. And it certainly provides, I think, a lot of employers more comfort to at least feel like they've done some due diligence, right? Certainly for maybe some skeptics in the organization that say, why do we have to work through this process in the first place, right? HR can say, look, we're not just, asking a yes/no question and taking it. We are asking follow-up questions. They have answered those satisfactorily, so now we do have to get to step 2.
Right.
Right.
Okay, so let's go to step 2 then.
Yes.
So we told employees they can make the request. They've made their request. They've completed the form, and now we're looking at what they told us, right? And that's where a lot of HR folks all across the country are just scratching their heads. You can almost hear the head scratching all together, right?
Just like when lice went around the school.
So, and the head scratching is largely centered around this question of, under Title VII, what is a religion? And you've alluded to it a little bit in saying it can be a religion of one. It could be a more formal religion, but your own beliefs may not align with the actual doctrine of that religion, etc. Right? So suffice to say, the definition of a religion under Title VII is pretty broad, isn't it?
It is very broad, and it's not probably a good use of time, right? Just to get yourself worked up into knots over whether
it's a religion or not.
If it's a world belief, if it's a belief in a system of, certainly if anything involves, a belief system involves a higher power, but also just a belief system of morality, et cetera, you can, a creative plaintiff's lawyer can get there without too much trouble. But that, Sarah, doesn't mean that every reason right, that someone gives an employer for not getting the
Right.
vaccine counts as a sincerely held religious belief. Even if they check the box that I'm asking for this accommodation because of a sincerely held religious belief, that religious belief is, right? And they fill it in, not everything counts as
I think correct.
as a religious
that
belief.
is right. That is right. And
So what kinds of reasons have you been
Right.
seeing that would not
right,
count?
right. And because we don't have enough to do in our lives, right? We've truly read every case that relates to vaccines and religious accommodations that exist to date. Now, to be clear, almost none of them relate to the COVID-19 vaccine, right?
Of course
These
not,
all
no.
date back to largely healthcare employers requiring their employees to receive the flu vaccine or other vaccines, and employees requesting exceptions to those requirements under Title VII, right?
Yep.
But those cases do help draw some lines,
Okay.
right? And so I do think it's helpful to have kind of an understanding of where those lines might be, okay?
Good.
The first thing I'll say is this. Remember, it doesn't have to be a direct tie to the doctrine of the religion itself. Okay.
Right.
In other words,
so if a religion doesn't specifically mention vaccines, right? A religion
or
doesn't
you're
have
not allowed to take medicine.
anything
or things
in
like
writing
that.
on its
Some religions
vaccine
do,
position.
to be clear.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, of course.
A
Yep.
few do.
Yeah.
In which case, then that's easy, right? I ascribe to this particular established religion, and under the religion we don't take vaccines. That's easy. It gets trickier though, because there are cases that support an indirect tie to a religion, and there's a case on this in particular. An employee saying, "I belong to this religion, and this religion believes that each individual should make their own choices, right, about what goes into their body."
Mm-hmm.
Or this religion doesn't believe in mandates. Okay?
We've seen a few of those.
We've
recently.
seen a few of those, right? That person has given the minimum amount of information, likely, to show a religious belief,
Yes, I agree with that.
even though it's indirect.
Yes.
Okay. Now, you mentioned, though, that a religion does have to be something more than just that person's personal preference,
Correct.
right? You mentioned a tie to, I think you might have said, an organization or a higher power, something like that, right?
Yep.
So when I think of lines that can be drawn based on the case law, there's sort of different buckets they might go in. The first one is this: the cost-benefit analysis of receiving the vaccine. And I've seen several requests that say this, right?
Many.
They say, essentially, I think there's risk to taking the vaccine, and I'm not at significant risk if I get COVID, and so I'm making a personal choice not to become vaccinated, okay? That standing alone, I don't think articulates a sincerely held religious belief. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that, but I'm going to ask you a tricky question.
Oh, don't do that. We're
Not tricky for you.
Okay, all right.
Tricky for folks that aren't as wise as you. So I've seen letters from religious leaders that include many different reasons, and some of them are, that indirect relationship between control over the person's body,
Right.
and being subject to a mandated vaccine violates that sincerely
Violates
held
the
religious
religion,
belief.
yes.
And then paragraph 2 is just that. The vaccine's, relatively recent. We don't know what's going to happen 20 years from now. And then paragraph 3 is another reason, right? So what do you do with an employee who gives you 2 reasons, right? risk-benefit analysis
Sure.
and sincerely held religious belief.
Well, first, I think you have to be careful because they have articulated both a sincerely held religious belief that might be protected under Title VII and one that might not be, right? Just because their second reason doesn't fall under Title VII doesn't automatically mean that their first doesn't as well.
Right, exactly. People can have more than one reason
Sure.
to not want the vaccine. I think that gets lost on a lot of people.
Well, and I think that would be a good opportunity for that one-on-one conversation we talked about, right?
Yeah.
To talk to the employee what that means. And it's also another reason to reinforce why it's a really bad idea just to accept those letters. Right. Make the employee pick the reason and put it in their own words and
exactly.
Right. Exactly. So that's the first example. What's another example of a request that you've seen that based on the case law you would feel confident this doesn't fall into the category of a protected religious belief?
I've seen an explanation that goes something like, I don't put anything foreign into my body. I just don't. I just
personal
don't think
philosophy.
it's healthy.
Right.
I eat all organic, whole food, pressed juices, cold, et cetera, et cetera. I haven't had vaccines in the past, right? I believe in the body's natural immune system, right, is the best way to heal itself, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, right, I cannot get the COVID vaccine. I don't think, unless there's anything extra that I did not just mention, I don't think that is a sincerely held religious belief.
But it wouldn't be hard to get from that to a sincerely held religious belief, right?
No.
So what did they...
A crafty employee could easily get there.
And what would they need to say to get there, do you think?
Well, they would need to tie it to some sort of belief system.
Exactly.
Right? And the world will be a better place. Society will be a better place. You know what I mean? Et cetera, if everyone, collectively did these things.
So the second bucket is just sort of, it is the difference between a personal philosophy, like being a vegan or not putting foreign things into my body, or I'm healthy, right? I have a certain lifestyle. Right. That's not a religious belief. But as soon as somebody ties that to any sort of larger belief system, then it could become a religious belief.
Exactly. And those lines can be hard to draw.
I was going to say, we're just splitting hairs here.
Don't worry, we're going to get to the punchline in a minute.
Okay.
Well, let's go through a few more of these.
A couple of other things that are not religious beliefs. Two big ones that I'm seeing a lot: fear of needles or the vaccine. Just fear by itself. I'm afraid of needles. Okay. Assuming they can't tie that to some sort of health impairment, which is a different podcast, right? We're not talking about that, but okay. And not a religious belief, but a political belief or stand. And I actually have seen several requests that talk about politics and who created the vaccine and theories about that, et cetera. That is not politics, thank God, are not religious beliefs.
That would be a great podcast.
The difference between politics and religion.
But for now, the case law is clear and helps us on that. That leads into another very common, it's often in the same explanation or in the same sentence, but it sometimes is on its own. It's just a concern about the safety of the vaccine itself, right? It was rushed through production, et cetera, et cetera. It's often tied to a political belief, right? Saying so-and-so did this for such and such political reasons, right? And therefore, the vaccine is not safe. And there's also information on the internet that, shows, purportedly, right, shows that the vaccine is dangerous. And some people believe that, right? So what if someone's...
It's floating around out there, right?
Yes, yeah. So a lot of times people will tie vaccine safety into politics, but oftentimes just vaccine safety alone. We've seen lots of long explanations, right? Just questioning the vaccine's safety,
right?
But without tied to anything,
a belief system,
then that's probably not going to be a valid request.
Okay. All right.
So should we give everyone the punchline now?
Yes, please. Let's do it.
just skip past all of that in practice, unless it's clearly outside the bounds, right? The types of things we've just discovered. It's very, very difficult to challenge whether someone's religious belief is sincerely held, whether it actually is a religious belief, right?
Sure.
I mean, these things are very difficult in practice to prove. But the good news is this is a 2-step process, right? Or maybe it's a 3-step. How many steps are we on?
I don't know.
I went to law school because there was no math on the entrance exam. This is an area where I see HR people kind of forgetting their roots. And once they're reminded, the light bulb goes off and they say, oh, right. Remember, this isn't, a lot of folks have mushed this all into one bucket, one step, an exemption request. It's really not that. It's an accommodation request. So first you have I'm just going to call it step 1. Is this a valid request, right? Did the person express a sincerely held religious belief, right? And say they can't comply with this particular policy because of a sincerely held religious belief, right? Just like if they were requesting something under the ADA for a disability-related concern.
Sure.
But remember, you have to get to the next step, which is, okay, you made the request, and we're going to accept it, right, for the purpose of this process, but can we accommodate it, right? So many people are just right there, right? So this one we suggest, despite the fact that we just had a lot of fun talking about it, in real life, not spending a whole lot of time, right? Most of your energy should not be there. Most of your energy in most situations will be in the next step.
On what to,
right?
What to
figuring
do next.
out, can we accommodate this request for this person not to be vaccinated?
And put otherwise, I mean, just because an employee has a religious belief that prevents them from being vaccinated doesn't mean then that it's safe for them to be in the workplace.
Correct.
That's not, and I think a lot of employees make that assumption, right? If I've got a sincerely held religious belief and I can't be vaccinated, my employer then must be required to just let me continue to work without pause, without further consideration, right? And what I hear you saying is not so fast.
Right, not so fast.
And that next step is what really warrants a lot of thought. And I think you're right about that, right? And that's also where we get to that individual case-by-case analysis.
This is, to me, where the rubber really hits the road, and what does and should take up the most amount of time. And it really should be an individualized process. Most of the folks listening understand generally the reasonable accommodation process, right, from the before days, mostly disability related. But the process is largely the same, right? An employee says, I can't do X, I can't follow policy X because of Y. Right? So let's accept that as true. But now we have to say, so what do we do with that?
Yeah, what do we do with that?
Can we just allow you not to do that thing? Or can we keep you employed, but maybe by doing something else, et cetera, just like any sort of accommodation request. And it is challenging, to say the least.
It's hard for HR folks. And so the EEOC's revised guidance did provide some additional information on what they think employers might be looking at as relevant factors as an employer is evaluating whether it would be an undue hardship to allow an unvaccinated employee to remain in the workplace, right? And
what types of things did they talk about? Because that's really, we have some things probably to add to that, but I think that's a great starting point.
Right. So they talked about whether the employee is working inside or outside, of course. Right? So
outside
construction,
safer,
outside is safer. We know that, right?
We know that now.
Close contact with coworkers, right? How the level of contact they have with coworkers throughout the day. They talked about the amount of contact that an employee might have with vulnerable people. That's going to be really relevant for our healthcare listeners, right, in the healthcare setting, right? That really spoke to them.
Yes.
Interestingly, they also talked about what percentage of the workforce is vaccinated, right? In other words, theoretically it poses less of a risk to let one unvaccinated employee work if everyone else is vaccinated. right?
But that's such a catch-22.
I know.
Right? Because if you grant a lot of
where's the
requests
line?
to say,
Where's the
okay,
line?
you can be unvaccinated and still continue in your job role,
Right.
then you won't get to that high vaccination rate, perhaps, that the EEO is saying would help you then
I agree with
grant
that.
a request. It's so circular.
And it feels very uncomfortable to say, well, we can accept the first 20, but no more. Which is
First
sort
come,
of
first
what
serve.
the EEOC is implying, right? Like you've got to draw the line. So
Employee relations nightmare.
yes,
Can you just imagine?
yes, I agree. I
Wow.
agree with you on that.
So I don't love that one, but it's in the EEOC's guidance. and
Yes.
certainly
What
something
else
to
would
think
you
about.
add that the EEOC didn't think of that an employer might be looking at?
I think we should look at disruption to operations if the
Right.
person is absent,
Agreed.
if they do get COVID or exposed to COVID. Right?
Because, right.
Vaccinated people we can argue about
Right.
the specific numbers here, but I'm pretty sure the science is with us that while breakthrough cases are certainly, we all know they're possible and are happening, it's less likely after exposure that you get COVID if you are vaccinated than if you are not. And also, for those folks listening to us in Michigan, everyone forgets about this, but we have this leftover statute, right, that is still in full force and effect,
Right.
that says if you're exposed, you have to stay home from work for 14 days, but if you're vaccinated, you don't have to.
Right.
Right? So there's a real difference in attendance potentially, right, between the vaccinated and unvaccinated employees.
I agree with that, and I agree that can absolutely be a relevant consideration. It's interesting to me that the EEOC really didn't talk about that at all, and they were more focused right on the workplace safety concerns. So
Yes, the EEOC is 100% laser focused on workplace safety, but I think we may have to look beyond that and just think about what I tell clients during these conversations is pretend you're in a deposition. I'm the plaintiff's lawyer. And I'm saying, really, right? Like, what kind of impact would this actually have had on you if one person, Sarah Willey, remained unvaccinated?
and was allowed to continue to go to work.
Yes, and was allowed to continue in her normal role, et cetera,
I think it's tough. Boy, I just want to
articulate it.
Right.
Articulate it.
I just want to say, I think our HR folks are being asked to make really, really hard decisions, many of which are based on information they don't have. Like, what really is the risk? Exactly. Right?
Yes.
For an employee who's unvaccinated to work, let's say, on a production line.
Yeah.
In contact with others. And does it matter if everyone's masked? And does it matter if that employee's masked? I mean, those are really public health questions. They're not human resource questions. Yet our human resource friends, resource friends are really being tasked with that responsibility to make those calls. And I just I can't solve that problem for them other than to help talk them through it, right? And make consistent decisions based on the best information they have.
Yes, and not jump to conclusions, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of noise about this right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to kind of put on headphones
Right.
and block all of it out and imagine yourself answering the question, right? What is the burden, right, to us?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's ultimately what the reasonable accommodation process in the religious exemption context comes down to, right? Will it place a burden on the employer, more than an insubstantial burden on the employer? And what is it? Risk to coworkers, right? Is certainly
top of the list. Disruption to
risk
operations,
to clients,
et cetera.
risk to the public, our customers, et cetera. Right.
What and lastly, okay, so as employers are thinking about those things, what other options and accommodations should they have in mind for employees?
Right. That's another error we're seeing, right? Employers get to the step we just got to and then stop, you can't do your job without being vaccinated. Sorry, right? And then don't get to the next step, which is there something else they can do?
Right.
Right. Now, with the religious accommodation request, right, you don't have to incur significant financial burden or anything like that. But, maybe there's open positions. As we all know, there's lots of open positions in most organizations now.
Fair point. Right.
Maybe there's a fully remote open position, for instance, that person could do. Maybe it's, if you decided the risk is too much for public-facing role, maybe there's a back office role in an office that closes, right? Maybe there's different positions the person is qualified for, right, that you are willing to say you can do that. Maybe an office position can be moved to be a remote position, right? Maybe there's testing that you would consider, maybe if the person agreed to continue wearing masks in the office, et cetera, et cetera.
So all of those things should really be on the list of considerations that an HR person should sort of tick down, in my opinion, right? If they're defending if they want to be in a position potentially to defend their decision, right? I think they want to be able to say, yes, first I looked at the essential functions of this person's job and concluded it would be an undue hardship or a risk to the employee or others to allow them to be in the workplace. Here's why, right? They provide direct patient care, for example.
Right, yeah.
And then secondly, here are the accommodations we considered, right? Yep. And you're exactly right. I think a different job is on the list. I think PPI, right? Masking and other things is on the list. Testing is a really interesting option.
That's a quagmire.
It's a quagmire because for those subject to the executive order related to federal contractors, the feds made the intentional decision not to let employees automatically test out, right? In other words, have a weekly testing option in lieu of being vaccinated, right? So we're sort of wondering whether that means then that the feds believe that testing is not a safe alternative. Sometimes employees have a temporary reason they can't get vaccinated. For example, if they are still symptomatic with COVID, the CDC says don't get the vaccine.
And they can't meet the deadline then.
And they can't, or an employee is pregnant, right? And the employee's healthcare provider says we don't advise this employee to be vaccinated. In that case, a leave of absence might be an option because the employee can be vaccinated down the road.
It really makes sense because of the labor shortage we're in to try to work with employees, right? I know our tendency in HR is we have a policy and we really want people to follow it.
Yes.
Right? That's kind of how we're all hardwired, those of us that live in this world. But in this specific environment that we're in, right, the great emotional reactions to having mandates being put in the first place, the fact that we can't hire enough people as it is, right, it really makes sense for HR folks to take a deep breath and say, what is the greater goal here? What are we trying to accomplish?
Right.
And is there a way we can keep this person employed, right, despite the fact that there's this accommodation need?
And I would just add that the one thing that I would say HR folks definitely shouldn't do would be to end somebody's employment because they're not vaccinated and due to a religious belief without engaging in any sort of reasonable accommodation process, right? Don't jump to the end.
Right, exactly.
Too fast, right? You gotta say you went through that process, and unfortunately, you gotta be able to show you went through that process with every employee who makes that request.
Boy, listeners are not going to like that.
No, I know. It
is a time. It's time.
Yeah.
There's no silver bullet. Right, to solve that for folks. But COVID has presented us with challenges in the past, right, and caused HR folks to use up their days in ways they did not think they would be when they got into the profession. So this is really no different, right, than what we've been working through the last 19, 20 months.
Excellent. Well, with that, I have a pile of religious accommodation requests on my desk, Rebecca, and I've got clients waiting to hear my thoughts on them.
So. Good luck.
Okay, thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Great.